guys, what's going on? This is the conservative speaking, and first off, I want to say Happy Black History Month. We are finally here in Black History Month. Isn't this amazing? Now, I normally don't celebrate Black History Month, mainly because it's been displayed the wrong way. So I care not to really heed into a lot of the propaganda that's into Black History Month. But considering that I am hosting the inauguration of the conservatives' perspective of Black History Month, this is something that I was more than willing to look forward to, and I'm glad that I'll be able to share my perspective of Black History Month to the people as a whole, because the one thing that we need to know more than anything else is the truth. And I am the person that's going to bring the truth, whether people approve of it or whether you disapprove of it. But just know for sure that I will always bring the truth. And we are going to kick off the first inauguration of the conservatives' perspective of Black History Month. The way that it should start, and that is the origin of Black history. Now, why is Black history even spoken about? Well, because it started with the transatlantic slave trade, which happened in Central and West Africa, where supposedly anywhere from 12 to 15 million Africans were captured by the Africans and sold either to Americans or to Europeans. But this is going to be a different slave trade, because everyone is familiar with the transatlantic slave trade, which was one of the biggest slave trades in world history. That is the slave trade that is responsible for bringing the vast majority of African Americans to America. Even though it's possible that a lot of the African Americans really did not originate from Africa. But I digress. I digress on that. The main thing that I want to really focus on is the slavery that nobody really talks about, and it's really, really, really taboo. And it's the slave trade that's really, excuse me 1 second. Okay. Those pesky robocalls. Gotta love them. The slave trade that a lot of people do not speak on is the Arab Muslim slave trade that occurred, and that's something that I really, really, really want to touch on, because I think it's something that a lot of people are not familiar with, that are not informed on, and it's really the slave trade that was the most brutal of all, and it is the type of slave trade that is still going on to this day. So without further ado, let's get into it. This is an article, by the way, from I believe the article is from let's see, where's it from? Yeah, so this is an article from Bob Koigi, Forgotten Slavery: The Arab Muslim Slave Trade. So starts as this. Over the years, global focus and discourse on slavery has concentrated on the transatlantic trade that featured the American and European merchants. On the other hand, has, however, remained largely ignored at times, even treated as a taboo subject, despite being a key component in the African history, owing to its devastating impact it had on the continent, its generations, and the people way of life. And as we go through this piece, you'll understand why. The Arab Muslim slave trade also known as the Trans-Saharan trade or Eastern slave trade, is billed as the longest, having happened for more than 1,300 years, while taking millions of Africans away from the continent to work in foreign lands in the most inhumane conditions. Scholars have christened it as veiled genocide, attributing to the tagline of the most humiliating and near-death experience slaves were subjected to, from capture in slave markets to labor fields across the harrowing journey in between. While official figures on the exact number of slaves captured from Africa in the Trans-Sahara trade are contested, most scholars put the estimate at about 9 million. So, close to what the to what the transatlantic slave trade was, because the transatlantic slave trade transported about anywhere from 12 to 15 million. The Trans-Sahara slave trade transported about 9 million. The Eastern slave trade in Africa was predominantly concentrated in the East and West African regions. In East Africa, the coastal region was the preferred route, and Tanzania archipelago of Zanzibar became a hub for this trade. The Arabs raided sub-Saharan Africa for 13 centuries without interruption. Most of the millions of men they deported have disappeared as a result of inhumane treatment. This painful page in the history of black people have apparently now have been completely turned. Read a loosely translated excerpt from The Veiled Genocide, a book by Teodane Ndiaye, a Franco-Senegalese author and anthropologist. Enterprising Arab merchants and middlemen would gather in Zanzibar for raw materials, including cloves and ivory. They would then buy back slaves who they would use to carry the raw materials and also work in their plantations abroad. Slaves from as far as Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia would be availed at the Zanzibar market and shipped through the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf of Arabic Peninsula, where they worked in Oman, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. African Muslims were, however, never captured as slaves due to the Islamic legal views. So it looks like all slaves, looks like, except for the African Muslims, would not consider to be slaves because of the way that Islam looked at born African Muslims. But every other slave was game, and it was the Arabs that were responsible for capturing these slaves. Black Arabs going after other blacks in Africa, capturing them, and then being able to sell them in the Zanzibar, in Zanzibar, and in the Zanzibar market, and they came from Sudan, Ethiopia, and Somalia, and then they were sold at the Zanzibar market to Oman, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Iraq. Interesting. Very, very, very interesting. On the other hand, the Trans-Saharan caravan concentrated on the West African region, straddling the Niger Valley to the Gulf of Guinea along the Trans-Saharan roads to slave markets in Maghreb and the Nile Basin. The voyage that world take up to 3 months involved inhumane conditions that saw slaves die along the way due to disease, hunger, and thirst. An estimated 50% of all slaves in this trade would die in transit. Now keep in mind, this is Africans, holding other Africans as slaves. All right, think about that before you decide to start blaming the white man for inhumane conditions. And if it was, and obviously if white people were able to own slaves and they put the slaves through the same type of treatment, then you should be able to then hold the very Africans, the blacks. You should be able to hold the blacks under the same conditions and under the same reprimand that you would give to white people owning slaves. While European merchants were interested in strongly built young men as laborers in their farm, the Arab merchants were more focused on concubinage, capturing women and girls who were turned into sex slaves while living in harems. How about that? So the Arab merchants, okay, merchants. Keep in mind, these are black slave owners looking to own slaves, were more focused on buying female slaves to then use as sex slaves. Isn't that amazing? Amazing that this is what black people will do to other blacks. All right, European merchants were more focused on young, strong black men to use them for labor. The Arabs, though, all right, the black Arabs were more focused on having young black women to buy as sex slaves. Amazing. You still want to say black excellence, black power? This is your example of black excellence, black power? That is amazing to me. That is amazing. This is the inhumane treatment that the blacks have treated other blacks, and it's never spoken about. All right. Obviously, no one wants to speak on the fact that you have Arab merchants, all right, grown men looking to have black women or to have black women as sex slaves, and they don't speak on their perversion of these young women being held as sex slaves. Amazing. Well, let's move on. So high was the demand that the merchants would double the price of female slaves, with the ratio of captured women to men being 3-to-1. And obviously that's due to having more females than males. Quote, the practice of castration on black male slaves in the most inhumane manner altered an entire generation, as these men could not reproduce. So not only were they captured, not only were these black male slaves captured, but they were castrated so that it will be known that they could never ever reproduce. Amazing. This is what black folks have done to other black folks. And yet you don't hear this in the African American studies. This is nowhere to be found. Nowhere will you see this in African American studies. But whenever you do get an opportunity to take on African American study at your next liberal college, ask them about the Muslim Arab slave trade. Ask them about that and see what type of response you'll get from them. Let's move on. Male slaves would work as field workers or guards at the harems to ensure that they would never reproduce in case they got intimate with their fellow female slaves. The men and boys were castrated and made eunuchs in a brutal operation where the majority lost their lives in the process. This is amazing. This is amazing that black people will do this to other blacks. This is beyond amazing. And this is something that you do not hear about. You don't hear about it in African American studies. You don't hear about it among black people who want to speak on slaves. But I'm glad that I'm able to bring something like this on my platform, regardless of how small it is. Because if there's one thing that we need to understand is the truth. And I will always bring truth to light, especially when it comes to black people. Everyone wants to talk about how white people own slaves and how white people did and how white people were inhumane to slaves, but yet no one talks about how the Arabs who were black themselves. No one talked about the Arabs committing inhumane conditions to other blacks and then treating them as property to try to sell to the next merchant. What about that inhumanity? No one wants to speak on that, but I will. The practice of castration on black male slaves in the most inhumane manner altered an entire generation, as these men could not reproduce. The Arab masters sired children with the black female slaves. This devastation by the men saw those who survived committing suicide. This development explains the modern black Arabs who are still trapped by history, says Liberty Mokomo, a lecturer at the University of Nairobi Institute of Diplomacy and International Studies. And pretty much this happened because you had they didn't want male slaves getting intimate with female slaves and getting pregnant. But even still, I mean, this has to be by far the most inhumane thing that a human being can do with another human being. I mean, take race out of it. The fact that you're able to take away somebody's ability to reproduce just so that you can sell them as property. How inhumane is that? And nobody speaks on that. See, nobody seems to want to speak on all the inhumane things that black people have done to other blacks. They don't speak on black killings that are more prevalent in America than racism. They don't want to speak on 1,800 black babies being murdered in the womb every single day due to Planned Parenthood. Okay. They don't want to speak on 77% of black babies being born out of wedlock. No one wants to speak on the most prevalent things that are occurring in the black neighborhood or in the black community, and the reason why the black community has gone on a decline due to that. But they want to speak on racism, systemic racism, institutional racism, but they don't want to speak on things that that the blacks have done to themselves and things that black people have committed onto other black people. This on its own, if white people were to do this to their own slaves, it would be the most egregious thing that they will come up with. It would be the most egregious thing that they will ever report, and they will make sure that every single school would learn about this. But how is it that every single school is not learning about the trans-Saharan slave trade? Gee, I wonder why not. Because this is something that's really more prevalent than anything that the transatlantic slave trade could ever bring. I mean, you talk about young male slaves castrated. All right? A lot of them dying from the castration process. And if they didn't die, they killed them. They committed suicide. But clearly that's not inhumane, because that's never ever spoken upon. Amazing. And even as Europe, one of the key players in the African slave trade, abolished the practice hundreds of years ago, and the United States officially ended it in 1865, Arab countries continued the trade, with majority ending it late in the 20th century. In Malawi, excuse my pronunciation. In Malawi, slavery was officially criminalized in 2007, with mentions of some Arab countries currently being involved, albeit clandestinely. So you still have some Arab countries that are still providing that. All right. The simple fact that Arab countries still believe this to be legal is mind-boggling, especially to the blacks who believe that slavery was wrong. That, oh, blame it on the white man, because it was the white man that was responsible for slaves being in America. Okay. That black slavery was wrong. Well, if black slavery is wrong, why is it that black people are not talking about the slavery that's occurring in Arab countries, and they're still occurring today? Now, some Arab countries have outlawed it, but it's still going on in some Arab countries to this day, and yet black people remain silent on that matter. Gee, I wonder why. Even as the rest of the world realized the harm slavery did to an entire continent and made a declaration to abolish it, the Arabs protested it, and it took a lot of international trade and revolt by the slaves for them to end it. But it is the degree and intensity with which it altered the entire social, reproductive, and economic life of black people that made it more brutal and painful than the transatlantic one. Yeah, you don't hear in the transatlantic slave about any of the slaves being castrated. Okay, that's something that happened in the trans-Saharan slave trade. You don't hear it in the transatlantic slave trade about slaves being castrated. But it happened during the Arab Muslim slave trade. And that one is the most prevalent one. I mean, you talk about someone chopping your manhood off. And slaves dying from it or committing suicide because of that. No one wants to speak on that. Amazing. That is amazing. And that's something that I wanted to speak on. Mainly because I believe it's a matter that needs to be spoken about. Because this slave trade shows how inhumane black people can be to other blacks. And yet the media, black scholars, and even black white scholars, all of the scholars seem to not want to touch on this type of inhumane slave trading. This is something that needs to be brought to light, because if we're talking about inhumanity, then we need to talk about real inhumanity. All right? And this is the worst type of inhumanity that you can hear of. I mean, that you can even speak of, that could even ever exist. And yet not one single person speaks on that. So whenever black people, whether they're scholars, non-scholars, or even white liberals, whether they're scholars or non-scholars, whenever they want to bring up slavery, this is something that I tend to bring. This is something that I will gladly bring to them. And I want to ask them a simple question. Well, if you want to talk about white people being slaves, okay? I'm sorry. If you want to talk about black people being slaves, then we need to put it in its proper context, okay? Because if you want to talk about white people owning black slaves and the fact that it was so inhumane, if you want to hold them accountable for that, then you also need to hold the Africans, the Arabs, responsible, or hold them accountable for not only them owning slaves, but the type of ownership that they had upon slaves. Because one can argue that the way that they treated their slaves was way more inhumane than the way white people treated their black slaves. The black Arabs, the way that they treated their black slaves, way more inhumane than white people treating their black slaves. Not to mention every single race in the entire continent owned slaves. But I'm just scratching the surface here. We'll get into that as the month of February advances. If you guys really like the video, all right, share the video, like the video. Let me know what you guys think, okay? Leave a comment in the comment section after you subscribe to my channel. And after you subscribe to my channel, click on the notification button so that you'll be able to be notified when my channel drops new content. And trust me, every single day you will get you will get video that encompasses the truth about black history. All right. And if you couldn't get it from the schools, and if you couldn't get it from higher learning, then you can get it for free on my YouTube channel. And with that being said, this is The Conservative signing out. Have a blessed day, guys.